As a SAN instructor, one of the things that we tend to recommend as the most important thing to do when studying for a certification is indexing. It's just a style of study, and it's our top most recommended one because, well, it works really, really well. So the thing is, with SAN certifications, so GIAC certification specifically, they're open book, which is really, really nice. And I also hear from a little birdie that soon we might be getting the opportunity to be able to take those GIAC exams remotely, which is going to be really nice while we're in quarantine, right? So no point in studying for something you can't actually take. That said, it's going to take a decent amount of time to and study to get these certifications, of course. So no reason not to start now, but I hear tell that we might be able to start taking some of these certifications from our quarantine bunkers here. With SANS exams, since they're open book, you get to take basically your massive stack of materials. All of this jazz, right? With you when you take a certification. For those who recognize the old style of book covers, hi, we've been together for a while, haven't we? The books look a little bit different right now. But so you get to take those books with you into the actual exam. And I like to say that it's a little bit like, say, the real world, where we've got problems and they come up and they're time delimited, but they're open book, right? So the most common resource we use in any kind of information security task is Google. I can't even think of a single penetration test or vulnerability assessment that I've ever done where I didn't use Google significantly on that actual test. Networks are unique and they take a lot of research in order to be able to actually test or secure or defend. If we see some weird network traffic, we got to do some research to figure out what that actually is, because we just don't know everything 100% of the time. It's just too much. And with SAN certifications in the exam, you only have a little amount of time to do it, just like real world. You only have a certain amount of time in your work week to actually get the job done. But you do have access to all of your resources. The problem is, when your books are this thick, it's not really going to be feasible during the actual exam to be able to look up everything easily. And so what we need to be able to do is know enough to be able to answer questions and make it through the test, or perhaps be able to leverage our materials in such a way that we can use them really, really powerfully during the actual exam in order to actually be able to look up the things that we don't know, for example. And indexing is the thing that we recommend for being able to do something like that. So I want to talk about some strategies for indexing here real quickly, as well as some of the power of doing something like that. So this, for example, is an index for the GSE exam. You'll notice that this one is pretty large. That's not necessarily what you should expect for most SANS exams or certifications. Most of the indexes are going to be quite a lot smaller, right? With the GSE is actually a certification that's based off of 3 different SANS certs. To get the GSE, you need to have 401, 504, and 503, plus at least 2 of them being gold or another 2 certifications in general as well. But what that means is that the actual written book exam for the GSE is actually 3 different sets of material in one. And so this index is large as a result. But for most exams, your index doesn't actually need to be that large. The goal of something like this is for us to be able to answer the actual questions on the exam that we don't necessarily know going into it within the actual time allotted. And there's of course a couple tricks and techniques that we can use to make that more powerful. Let's take a look here. So if we open up an index like this here, we'll see that it looks a little bit like Encyclopedia Britannica. There we go. I think that's mostly in focus. In any case, what we've got here is topics, things like here, this is an exam thing for 660, the GXPN. So it's got things like registers here. So it says something like ECX and RCX and describes what those kind of things are in here. But most importantly, it says, hey, here's an EAP shadow attack. Where in the material is the information about that? And here in 660, it's book 1, page 75. And so if we have something that comes up as a question during one of these exams, now we can use our index to show us where in our actual material that information is. And this is really, really helpful because during the actual exam, you don't have the time to flip through page after page after page. And so if we have a sans book like this here, we've of course got the slide, which is what we saw during the actual class, if we've taken the actual class, and then underneath we have this notes section. Now that note section is really important, particularly when we're thinking about things like indexing for the actual exam. As an example here in this book, this one is from 560 day 4. So in this book we see that you've got the slide, then you've got a couple paragraphs afterwards. Now if we look at the actual slide content, the first paragraph, or maybe the first 2 paragraphs, they generally regurgitate in paragraph form, so as a narrative, the information we actually see in the slide. But those later paragraphs, they tend to talk about things like, well, here we're talking about landman hash algorithms. That last part might talk about additional information that goes beyond the actual material discussed in the slide itself. So this is really important. It means that if we build our index based on the slides, the most common way I see people do indexing, wrong to be fair, is they focus on these slide titles. They might say, okay, in my index, I've got a slide title called Landman Hash Algorithms. But maybe in this bottom section, it's talking about things like, hey, a des key. Okay, when we look at our index, are we going to know to look under Landman Hash Algorithm for something about des? And the answer, of course, is no. We won't know that going in. So what we want to do is we want to actually focus on the material that's in the notes. And there's 2 reasons for that. A, because we might miss it if we just have slide titles. But B, because there's a lot of information in the notes that isn't in the slide itself. And more importantly, during the actual time of the exam, if we're flipping through the book, right, and we're going page by page by page because there's something in here that we don't know the answer to and we're trying to find it, if it's actually in the slide, during the exam, we have a pretty decent chance of finding it, even without an index, even if it's not in our index. But if it's in the dregs of our notes, the very bottom here, we're going to have a lot of trouble finding that information during the actual exam itself. And so what we want to focus on when building our index is that kind of information. Some classes, like say the new 504, they actually have things like an index in one of the books, right? That index tends to be based off of the slide titles because it actually is generated by a script written by Josh Wright. Really nice script. It's a PowerShell script that goes to the actual PowerPoint and builds an index based off those types of things automatically. But in my opinion, it actually makes for a false sense of security because you realize, hey, everyone says I need to build an index, but the class comes with an index. Why not just use that? The thing is, if you do that, you're going to have a really, really hard time on the exam. For example, my class 460, we don't do that. Like, Josh Wright's made that script available to us. We could add that in there, but I feel like if you're provided with that kind of index, it's actually going to make you fail the exam. Because you'll think you've got an index, and you kind of do, but it has nothing to do with the actual material, let alone the material that's going to be hard to answer during the actual exam. So I don't recommend doing that at all. And I definitely don't recommend relying on one of those kind of indexes. You want to base it off of the material, particularly the material that's in the bottom of these note sections here. Now let's think about a couple other things for indexing that can make your index a little bit more powerful. The goal here when we're wargaming a certification exam like say a GIAC one is to be able to maximize our opportunity to succeed, right? So if, let's say we've got a question, it's a multiple choice question, let's say there's 4 options and it's A, B, C, and D, right? So right off the bat, if we just blindfold ourselves and pick one, right, throw a pin at it, we've got a 25% chance of getting it right. Now you won't pass the exam with a 25% success ratio, so you need to do a little bit more than that, but we already have a 25% chance. Now with testing, right, and test building, there's a couple things to think about. Let's say, for example, that the question is something like this. Which of the following is a remote code exploitation framework? Okay. And then answer A is Cobalt Strike, B is Nessus, C is Saint, and D is immunity canvas. Okay, so what's the right answer here? Well, first off, let's say that there's 5 options. Let's just add in an E, right? So E might be something like subterfuge. Subterfuge is a remote, not a remote code exploitation framework. It's a man-in-the-middle tool. And so it's completely an outlier. It has nothing to do with any of the other options. It doesn't have anything to do with the question. We can throw that one out. So if it was, say, 5 options, A through E, now we went from 20% up to 25%. This is not a given, but it is actually pretty common in the way that we see test questions kind of developed. And if you've been to, high school or university or whatnot, you'll see a lot of that same kind of strategy. Now, the next 2 sets are really interesting. Nessus and Saint are both vulnerability scanners. They're not code exploitation frameworks, but they're vulnerability scanners, which means that they actually have something in common. And so the question is trying to figure out if we know the difference between vulnerability scanning tools and attack utilities. And so Nessus and Saint are vulnerability scanners. If we realize that differentiation, we can take those 2 and we can put those off the side. Now we're up to a 50-50. Is it Cobalt Strike or is it Immunity Canvas? Now it says remote code exploitation framework. Cobalt Strike is a really good remote operations tool. I use it all the time when doing, say, red team style work and such. But it's not a code exploitation framework because there's no exploits in it. And so what's happening here is that the question is actually throwing in an option that we are probably pretty familiar with, right? Cobalt Strike's pretty well known. Immunity Canvas has been around longer, but it's less well known. So our knee-jerk reaction might be to go with Cobalt Strike, but we have to think about what the question is trying to test us on, right? That question's been designed to test our knowledge of something. The difference between exploits and operations in this case. Now that's a bit of a tricky question. Most of the ones on GIAC exams won't be quite that tricky, but the point is this. We want to think about what knowledge that we're supposed to have for this certification that question is trying to test our awareness of. So Immunity Canvas here is that answer. Now what's interesting here is that with GIAC exams, when you sign up for one, you actually get 3 exams. You have an exam, right? But then you also have 2 practice tests. And we can look at those practice tests as a bit of an opportunity here. Now, those practice tests will never have a question that's on the real exams, but they might have flipped questions. For example, what if that same question we just walked through said, which of the following is an enterprise vulnerability scanner? Suddenly that answer is Nessus. That might be a question we see on the test versus one on the practice exam. So we want to think about that with the practice exams because they really are a great opportunity for us to maximize our opportunity to be successful on the actual certification exam. Right, so let's say this is 560, right? Because we're looking at a 560, actually it's a 503 book. Sans books. Let's say it's penetration testing, right? So during the penetration testing class, you use Metasploit all the time, day in and day out, because it's the #1 remote code exploitation framework. You might have a GIAC question like the one we just discussed, where Metasploit is what we know is, oh yeah, Metasploit's a remote code exploitation framework. But the question doesn't have that as one of the answers. It's got a bunch of other ones. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is what belongs in our index and what doesn't. For example, yes, there's a 560 index. All right, so if we go to M in this index, I've got Metasploit listed here. But the thing is, why would I, particularly me, right? Why would I put Metasploit in my index? Obviously, I know what Metasploit is because we had, 5-6 labs on it over the course of the week. Somebody asked you a question about, is Metasploit a remote code exploitation framework? By the end of 560, yeah, we know that. So why is it in the index? Well, in this case, it's in the index, but there's also no actual details given after it. Why? Because of that question. What if Immunity Canvas was only referenced in a subordinate paragraph in the notes? So we missed it and it didn't make it into our index. We go under I, no Immunity Canvas. How do we find it? Well, the thing is, we know, right, our knowledge, we know that Metasploit's a remote code exploitation framework. So when the material is introducing Metasploit, it's introducing remote code exploitation frameworks, right? So if we went to Metasploit in the book and we looked at the notes, what's the likelihood that Immunity Canvas is going to be right there? Or maybe within 1 or 2 slides of that. And so we need to think about that with our index too. Don't just index the things that you don't know or are trying to remember. Index the things you do know, because the things you know can be pointers to places in your books, in your material, where the things you don't know actually live. A couple other things you might want to consider for your indexes. Take a look at the GSE index I have here. At the very back, you might recognize this. It's a little bit shiny. Actually, let's pull that off. I've got a see-through cover sheet, so you can flip it over and you can see immediately what the contents actually are. This is one of the cheat sheets. This cheat sheet is actually the TCP/IP cheat sheet. Because GSE, one of the classes there is 503. So a lot of things about PCAP and network traffic are really important to know about. And so to be able to flip your notebook, or your index rather, just to the back, right? Just you got the index open, close it, flip it to the back. Immediately you have this handy dandy reference here. So I do recommend taking your cheat sheets and putting them in the back of your index, because then you have them for reference. For me, when I took the GSE, it was actually years after I'd taken the 503 exam, the GCIA. And so the course material had actually changed significantly, and my books just, well, they didn't have all this stuff anymore. For example, when I took 503, and yes, this is a while ago, Bro wasn't all that big of a thing yet, and so it wasn't actually in the courseware. When I took the GSE, of course it was. And at the time, I didn't know anything about Bro, like at all. I'd never used it. Very familiar with Snort, but I just hadn't used Bro much at all. That's since changed. It's a great tool. It's Zeek now, but it's an absolutely outstanding tool. But at the time, I didn't know anything about it. So I went online and I just printed out a Bro manual, and then I just put it in the back of my index. Didn't really know how to use it, didn't use the tool at all. It wasn't in my material, but you can bring this in with you to the exam. So during the actual exam, I learned how to use Bro. And the thing is that that's a powerful opportunity for all of us, because it means we can go into the exam, and if we missed something, right, if there was a topic that we fell asleep on during day 5 because it's 8 hours of slides straight, or if it's 401, you got boot camps on top of that, right? If we missed something, well, our index can give us the opportunity to learn that during the actual exam. But to do that, we have to be pretty efficient in using it. So let's talk about index efficiency next. So, if you look at this index, I've got 2 columns here. This is actually part of a speed reading technique. So if you learn speed reading, one of the things that they tell you is that one of the things that slows you down the most when you're reading is actually your eyes tracking along the lines in the sentence. So what you want to do is you actually want to take a snapshot. So you look at the left side of the page, snapshot, and then you look at the right side of the page, snapshot. So it's 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You don't actually follow what you're reading, you're using your peripherals, and so as a result, your eye movement is lessened and your speed of reading is faster. So with these 2 columns, each column is essentially a snapshot, which is going to make us faster. Now, of course, this is silly, right? I mean, this is going to save maybe 0.1 seconds off of a lookup, right? Maybe even less than that. 0.05 of a second, maybe. But think about this. Let's say that it's multiple choice, and there's 4 potential options, right? Nessus, Saint, Metasploit, and Immunity Canvas, or whatnot, right? Cobalt Strike. Those are actually pretty decent things for us to look up, right? If we don't know what the answer is, or if we want to confirm that our intuition is correct, we could look those things up. Metasploit, right? That's a lookup. That lookup just saved 0.1 seconds. If we had to do it 4 times, that's 0.4 seconds. If we have to do this across 120 questions, you see where I'm going here, right? We're saving minutes by each individual small efficiency increase, because aggregated over the course of a 2-hour exam, those things really start to add up. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is give us the opportunity to succeed, even if we just don't know something, and we have now the opportunity to learn that information during the actual exam, because we've made as many choices as we could to increase our efficiency as possible. That is also why we've got these tabs. Right? A through Z. For the Canadian folks out there, and the Brits. Alrighty, so with these tabs, if the thing starts with A, of course, we just jump to A, and we've got that information right there. That's going to save us a lot of time, too. I recommend that you absolutely do this, and that you spiral bind this notebook. For first-time GIAC testers, test takers, one of the things I most commonly see folks do is they're going to use Excel for their indexing. They'll create a bunch of cells in Excel, and they'll sort it alphabetically. Okay, so far so good. And they'll print it out and they'll staple it together. The problem is, like, I've legitimately seen and mentored people who failed exams that they probably could have passed if they didn't have an index at all. But they failed it because they had to fight their index during the actual exam, right? Like, you flip back and forth a bunch of times and suddenly your staples fall out. Now you've got all these sheaves of paper that you're like jumping through, and then you look back at the clock and you have 15 minutes left in the exam. We don't want to do this. Any office supply store, any major office supply store, they've got book binding machines there. And so this GSE index, to bind it with the clear cover sheets on both sides, that's about $8 to $10 US. If you also do the printing there, if it's black and white, you're probably talking about 15 bucks. Color is really expensive. So if you do it in color, like this one is, this one's in color. If you do it in color, it's probably gonna be something like 22 bucks. But when we're talking about a big exam, right, for a certification that costs hundreds of dollars, for a class that costs thousands of dollars, what's 20 bucks, right? On the note of color, some of mine are colored, and some, I think this one isn't. Nope, this one's colored too. Yeah, and some of them are black and white, like this one here. Nope, this one's also in color. I promise I've got a black and white one in here somewhere. Not that one. Yes, I've got a lot of these. Right, we're not gonna look for a black and white one. It's in here somewhere. The point is that black and white is cheaper, but the color actually pulls your eyes to it, right? If it's black and white and it's bold, that helps a little bit. But if it's in color, the first thing we want to look at when we're looking at our index is actually that title, and the color is going to help out with that as well. So you don't need to make them color. Again, this is going to shave 0.1, 0.01 of a second off of a lookup, but again, it starts to add up over time. So I guess more of mine are in color than I realized. I'm just like making money rain, right? 20 bucks instead of 15? Yeah, go for it. Let's see here. Cover sheets. You can do clear cover sheets. There's really no point in having like a front page that talks about what GIAC exam it is. And there's also really no point in having a opaque sheet on the back. Because the clear cover sheets do actually really help if you're trying to look up and you've got some specialized piece of information on either side here. But vanity, so I put a cover sheet on top because I'm vain. You can also make things that are specialized for you when you take your own exams. I've got it here somewhere. So this, and this is a Google Doc, so I'll link to it actually in the chat at some point, so everyone can have it, because it's something I made to help me out. For example, people are pattern matching machines. So this is for, say, 503 style material, where you have to look at a lot of PCAP. And in PCAP, you'll see some things that just always stand out, like C0A8, that's 192168 in hex. And if you see enough PCAP, it just starts to kind of make sense. But why memorize these things when you can pattern match them? So if you look here, I'm colorblind, so I might be wrong with these colors, but this green section, that's the IP header, and then here, this blue section is the TCP header. They're always the same length whenever you see PCAP. So we know that right here is where TCP starts, which means source and destination port, right there, which means we don't actually need to know or read left to right the PCAP. We can just pattern match these things. And when we talk about ports, some ports are really common. And so we may want to actually take those ports and put the hex as a list down here. So here you see it actually breaks down each one of these portions, and you see the hex here, and then you've got a bunch of different port numbers like, say, 80 and so on. But in hex, because then we don't have to do that math. Is it because we couldn't do the math? No, it's because if we don't have to do it, we can answer the question a lot faster. And that's the goal. And again, I'll link that in the chat here in just a little while. Because I found that that's been helpful for people. But again, you can make your own little like shortcut guides, your own little cheat sheets, and you can throw those in your index as well. And together, this makes for a really powerful way to actually study for the exam. The genesis for this little chat is actually based off of a tool that I just released, or a new version of the tool that I just released, called Voltaire, which helps people make exams. So I want to demo that here for a little bit. I'm going to jump over to the computer and show that off. So this tool's free for you to use. It's at voltaire.publickey.io. When we go to it, it asks you to log in. I'm not trying to steal your information or your email addresses or anything like that. The tool just needs to be able to. And so now that you've logged in, you'll see indexes that you've made. If you haven't made any yet, you can make indexes. And then you'll see this one pop up at the very bottom, new index you've made. We can also import indexes. If you used Voltaire in the past, there was an import feature. That import feature was actually here when you logged in and were interacting with your index. I've removed that for a couple reasons. The way the old feature would work is that you would import an index, but it would import it over top of your old index. So I had a couple folks who created an index and then deleted their index by importing over top of it. So I've removed that. I'm sorry. That was a really poorly designed feature. Yeah, sorry. As a result, now when you do the import index, it'll actually create a new index for you here. So if you go to import, we can upload a file, desktop. Here's a test Excel spreadsheet, and yes, it now supports Excel as well. In the past, it was just CSV. But now it works with Excel as well as CSV, so you don't have to export to CSV or anything like that. The old feature kind of sucked because what it would do is it would try to split your CSV based on those commas, right? Comma separated. But if your index had a, say, description section where there's actually a comma in your description because you're, like, say, typing out of the book, well, there's now a comma that's going to break your index. Oops. But since it now has Excel, you don't have to worry about that anymore at all. So we import that. And so now we can see that new index. We go to edit, and you see here's the 2 lines that were in that actual Excel spreadsheet. Here's the actual Excel index that we just saw here. And so when we build an index, we're going to do it by title, description, page, and book, because that's the information that we actually need to know when we start building an index like this. So we see a little bit of description, we see a little bit of the title here. In this case, it's on 460, so 460 is, there we go. 460 is on vulnerability assessment, so vulnerability assessment, page 5, book 1. Makes sense. The reason we do it like this is so that you can have the information you need for your actual index, right? So if we have, say, a title, but the title's a bit ambiguous, the description gives us a little more information on that. But one of the things we need to think about is, let's say we had Metasploit here. Metasploit. Should we put a description? The thing is, if we really know what Metasploit is all about, we want it in our index so we can use it as a pointer to find other things. But do we want to spend the time writing out a full description of Metasploit when we actually know what it is? And so what we need to think about here is actually something called the Pareto principle, or the 80-20 rule. So if we look at our index, in fact, let me pull an index over here real quick. Yeah, here we go. This is one of the first indexes I ever made. It's on GH 504, incident handling. And this is actually one of the biggest indexes I've made for a single class, because it was one of the first ones, didn't really know what I was doing. And if you look at this, like, each one of these terms here, they've got a lot of description underneath them. That's fine, but it takes a lot of time to do that. And so when I took that exam, I actually found that 20% of the questions were actually answered in the index. I didn't even need to do a lookup because the description actually had the answer in them. That's really cool. But that took so much time. 80% of the time was spent just doing that for 20% of the actual answers. So you can do this. I'm not saying don't. But after doing it the first time, I found that I'm doing it less and less and less. Each successive exam, I do less and less in the description section. Often, I just leave it blank, because the answers are going to be in the book. And if we can find that in the book, why spend that 80% of the time when you're only extracting 20% of value there? So when we think about building our index and studying, we also have to think about the value of our personal time. One of the reasons why we tend to recommend indexing is it's actually a really good way to learn the material too. You'll find you're using your index a lot less than you might expect because you just know the answers since you built an index. But if we're just copying over description, we don't necessarily get that same kind of value for our time there. So it's up to you, of course, but I tend to leave a lot of these different things blank. For example, let's take a look at one of these in Voltaire. So here's the 660 index, and you'll find as it goes down, I got lazier and lazier and lazier, and we start to see a lot of blank stuff here. You got the terms, which is what we really need. You got a lot of blank stuff. I mean, do I know all about, say, Win debug? No. Could I put a description here? Sure. Did I? No, I'm a lazy person, so I didn't. But we still have that key benefit here, where we get 80% of that value, that title, and the page, and the book, where it is actually in the material. Let me see, there's a couple questions, so I want to answer those real quick. How do you index long lab topics like 503, multi-book scenarios for exams like GIAC with huge indexes? That's a really good question. So when it comes to labs, right? So in SANS classes, we've got a lot of labs because we want to give you hands-on opportunities. So since I've written a course, I had the chance to talk to GIAC about the testability of material. And I've also taken a bunch of exams, so I'm pretty familiar. GIAC does build questions about material that's only discussed in the actual lab. This is true. But they don't do a lot of it. And the reason for that is they tend to be asking questions about a topic or about something. Labs tend to be about showing or teaching by doing, right? So in almost all SANS classes, not 100% true, but in almost all SANS classes, the information in the lab is actually introduced in the material, and you just perform it in the lab. As a result, there's very rarely actually questions about the lab. Now, there might be questions that ask you about something that's done in the lab, and they give you a scenario. Let's say it's 503, right? They say something like, they give you a fragment of PCAP, and they say, here's a scenario. This organization was under attack by a cyber actor, and their web application stopped responding. Why did this happen? And in this case, let's say the answer is that it was a SYN flood attack, right? So you might look at the actual PCAP and see, oh, we see a bunch of SYNs, but we don't see fully completed three-way handshakes, right? There's no SYNAC and then ACK to complete the connection. It's just SYN, 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 SYN. So the question's answer here would be something like, oh, it's a SYN flood DOS attack, right? You might do that in an actual lab in the class, but the actual information, the material that you need to know about what does it look like to see a DOS attack is probably discussed in the actual slides. So for me, I tend to index material that's actually in the lab content a lot less than information that's in the actual slide material. It's not because you won't find questions that are in there, but they're a very small minority, maybe like 2 to 5%. In my experience. And again, of course, that could change in the future. And it's, of course, important to understand how to do these kind of things, particularly for some of the newer exams, like let's say the new version of 560 that actually has lab component in the actual lab itself, in the exam itself, excuse me. But from the perspective of multiple choice questions, I tend to find that you don't get a huge amount of questions based off of lab specific and lab only material. All right, let's look at the rest of Voltaire here. So if you used Voltaire in the past, this will look really familiar. Let's build a new index, shall we? So we add in a title. Let's say that we're talking about something like, threat modeling. Maybe that's on page 85 on book 1, and we say something like, all about the bad guys. Okay. So we've now added things onto our index here. There's a couple new features that we see that are really nice. We've got a little ribbon tool here on the left-hand side with some additional resources. One is the settings page. Now the settings page is beta, okay? I wanted to get this out for everyone because there's some really good improvements here that I think are gonna help people out a lot. But it does mean that there's a couple things that are a little wonky, let's say. So here in this settings page, we've got this new test index that we built. We can actually export the history of it. And if we click download, we'll actually see the history of all the things that we've added to the index. So we just added that threat modeling line. It's here. If we added more lines, we'll see those there as well. If you delete your index, you'll still have the history. The goal of this feature is that whenever you add new stuff to your index, it's actually stored in a completely separate database table. So when you click delete, you're actually deleting your main index. You're not deleting the history table at all. So that information is always stored. And you should be able to go in here and click export and then download it even after you've deleted it. In January, I enabled 24-hour cyclical backups. So if you ever lose something, I can restore your indexes from 24 hours in the past. And that's 100% of the time too. It's also separate. It's stored as a separate JSON file. I'll have to push it manually, so it takes me like 10-15 minutes, which is why I want to make sure you have access to this yourself. But you won't lose your stuff. There's 2 separate styles of backup. One of the next features that's coming out is actually a 3rd style of backup. I want to make it such that with Voltaire, you can use HTML5 cache storage, so that you can actually do this offline. So for example, I've had a couple people who lost a bunch of their index because they were indexing on an airplane. Okay, well, nobody's indexing on an airplane right now, right? So they were indexing on an airplane, right? And so they didn't have access to the internet. And their computer crashed, or it turned off, or they closed the browser, right? And so suddenly their index, all the stuff they made while it was on the plane, was gone because they just weren't connected to the internet. Right now, it's not a feature, so you need to be connected to the internet when you're indexing. Please do. But one of the next features I'm going to add is actually going to be HTML cache storage, such that even if you index and you're not connected to the internet, next time you connect, it'll sync up and you'll have all your data there too. So that's coming soon. It's also a resources page. I'll be adding on to this resources page over time, just with additional stuff from all kinds of people. Here's actually a blog post. And this is a blog post on my recommendations for indexing for GIAC exams with a YouTube video. You see that exam index that I was showing off earlier, some Voltaire stuff, recommendations on how to test, some example questions, those kind of things. As well as some additional stuff from external parties, which are also listed here on this index page. For example, Hacks for Pancakes is a really good blog post on indexing for GIAC as well. Her strategies are a little bit different than mine, but there's really never one size fits all method, right? So she likes to use a lot of these little tabs with colors. I'm colorblind, so that doesn't work for me. But it helps her get through the pages, and that might work really, really well for you as well. Here she's got her showing off how she does it with Excel and those kind of things too. But the point is, here in this resources page, I want to collate resources from across the industry, from all kinds of people, and share that, right? So here's an prep guide that's actually by GIAC, and you'll notice the really old school GIAC slides, but so that's also for your edification and for help. So over time, I'm just going to keep adding on to this resources page. It'll get longer and longer with maybe more videos or stuff from other parties like GIAC or say Leslie Carhart. That's Hacks for Pancakes. And then of course we can start indexing. Let's see, what else is there? Oh, right, build index. So the build index is a lot different than it was in the past too. So here, if we want to say make a doc style index for Sec 60, we could say my new lead index, and we can click generate. And so when we build this index, we open this sucker up, and there we go, my new index. And here you go. Your tabs are made for you. Page breaks are already there. Your main words your titles are bolded. Here's your book and page number. In the past, it just kind of created an HTML thing that you would paste into Word because I was really lazy. And it turns out that this took a metric ton of time to build. Microsoft Office is complicated and sucks. But it works now. So you see even your page numbers here and all of that jazz. You can, of course, edit this, and I do recommend you do, right? So if you want to add on your extra cheat sheets to the back of it, do that. If you want to, these are actually headings as well. So if you want to change all the headings, you can actually go in and modify the heading. And let's say you want to change the color to blue. That'll change that color, and it'll change it for all of your other headings as well. So these are actually like word style types. So if you want to change it across everything, the style types, they'll automatically change once you just modify it like that. Because it's Word, you can also take advantage of spell check. For example, I don't know how to spell optimistic. Evidently, it's got an extra O in it in my mind. when you're indexing and you're typing things really, really fast and going through hundreds of pages, you're of course going to make small mistakes. Like here we see IPMI, but I haven't actually put a space between it and tool. And we don't want to have that for our index when we actually go in to take the exam. But since it's in Word and it's not some kind of just auto-generated PDF, we can go in and we can change and we can modify all of this stuff. So that should be helpful as well, I think. Let's see. What else? Oh, right. The things that don't work. So if you look here at the index, these are the types of output that I would like to get for you, say doc, PDF, JSON, and CSV. Right now, CSV export works for export history. It doesn't actually work here. So PDF, JSON, and CSV, they'll all just export you a doc, but it is coming. I'm not sure if I'm going to do PDF. I might just drop PDF from the options here because I think doc is just superior to it. And that's about it. I hope that this video was useful for you. I hope that these study tips are going to help you in your endeavors as you go out to get those certifications. And I hope that this tool, Voltaire, is going to be useful for you as you begin your preparations for the test and then move on to get those certs. As always, happy hacking.